Okay, well, I will get started. I would like to say thank you. Welcome to all of you who took time out of your summer to be a part of this webinar on this Friday afternoon. I would also like to take some time to thank both Dr. Walker and Emily, as well as anyone else who was in a position to where they could support me in my ability to attend this very expensive workshop. We can talk about the cost a little bit later if people are interested. But I just want to say thank you to them. And today I plan to just give a introduction to the DSSAT crop model. And in the literature, you will see that it is consistently referred to as the DSSAT crop model. However, I don't want you to necessarily think of it as a crop model itself, but it's a tool that incorporates many different crop models for many different types of crops. So it's more of a science-based research tool that can be applied or can be used by farmers and policymakers in making crucial decisions that have financial and economic as well as food security impacts in local, regional, and even global scales. So with that, we'll get started. Let's see. So we'll first start off with a brief description of the evolution of crop models since the late 1960s, as well as the motivation for DSSAT, where DSSAT came from, as well as we'll kind of refine or continue to define DSSAT in the framework of it being a tool that farmers and policymakers, as well as scientists, can use in making crucial decisions about future cropping systems. Then we'll get into the necessary inputs that DSSAT requires in order to run its crop models with. So that deals with the concept of a minimum data set, which we'll talk about. Within the minimum data set, there also is a requirement for specific weather data to also be used. And we'll talk about those requirements as well. Following that, we'll talk about applications of the DSSAT tool with its various crop models that it incorporates. We'll also talk about limitations of tools or models like DSSAT. And then we'll get into also thinking about other considerations that must be considered when using and utilizing this type of a tool to consider future management practices. And then we'll follow up with how I plan to incorporate the DSSAT tool into my research related to the Missouri Transect and how that relates to the Missouri River Basin. And then we'll follow up with a summary. So this slide shows you all 50 of the participants that come from 20 different countries around the world. So it's quite a diverse background. Most of the attendees have some sort of a background in agronomy or crop science, phenology, growth, crop or plant science. So that is helpful when you go into a workshop like that to have that kind of a background. There were a few others kind of like me who had more of a climatological or meteorological background, who learned new things about crop science and agronomy, as well as crop growth phenology. So it was a good experience for that. It was a 6-day workshop in Griffin, Georgia, which is 30 minutes south of Atlanta. Overall, again, it was a very diverse group of people. On the second row, sitting down, I should say, are the instructors for the course. I mentioned it was a 6-day workshop. 6 days was not long enough because it is still a fairly, even though it's a Windows-based software program, it's still fairly complex, especially for those people who are not so much familiar with crop science. So let's start talking about crop modeling since the late 1960s. Around the world since then, there have been 2 primary groups of modelers. The Dutch started in the late 1960s dealing with sucrose family of crop models. One of their famous ones that is still ongoing, as indicated by the arrow, is a rice model developed by the Dutch. There have also been early attempts at modeling cotton growth by the United States early on in the process. But in the mid-1970s is kind of when you start to see other crops begin to model, such as soybean or peanut, wheat or maize for that matter. Now, I've kind of basically just summarized on the left what you see on the image on the right-hand side. You'll notice an @ symbol next to some of the model names, or the crop model names, I should say. And that indicates that that model is no longer being used. It was likely developed by a single scientist at a single university, or at a single scientist at a university that retired. And because he preferred maybe to work by himself, or nobody liked his crop model, it was only him or her that was working with that crop model. So the model was no longer something that would continue running after they retired. So the more successful efforts are the group efforts that incorporate a lot of interdisciplinary aspects to the modeling efforts. So that is also one reason why DSAT is so successful. There were these existing soybean models, peanut models, and other models like wheat and maize that were going before DSAT ever came about. But when DSAT finally came about in the mid-1980s, DSAT then incorporated these already individually existing models, and they refined those models and advanced those models to the point so that they could actually be encompassed in this DSAT tool. So you now have what is considered crop grow, which is a cropping system model essentially built in DSAT that accounts for things like soybeans and peanuts. And then you have a generic cirrus, which is accounting for wheat and maize within the DSAT cropping system model. There's also an effort down in Australia. Australia actually borrowed some code from DSAT and just kind of altered the code a little bit to do another group modeling effort. So there are other tools besides DSAT. So that is important to acknowledge in this slide. So let's talk about the justification or what was the main motivation for DSAT coming about. Back in 1982, the United States Agency of International Development gave money to a group of international scientists around the world who were a part of this group called EPSCoR, the International Benchmark Sites Network for Agrotechnology Transfer. And this group was seeking to investigate poverty across the globe. So they got the 10-year project funded by USAID for $10 million. That's $1 million per year. And with this aim to investigate global poverty, this was really the main motivator for why DSAT was born, why this tool was teased out of this. Something that you see in blue here is that DSAT v2.1 was released in 1986. That is actually the first version of DSAT. I don't know why it's not version 1. They did not mention that when I attended the workshop, and I forgot to ask them. But anyway, the initial release was actually considered v2.1 in 1986. Currently, we're up to version 4.6, and version 4.7 should be hopefully released later sometime this year. If I'm going too fast for anybody, or if I need to talk differently so you can hear me better, please let me know. I should have mentioned that earlier. So this is DSAT. This is, again, it's a science-based research tool that allows farmers and policymakers, as well as scientists, to look at analyses of crop production, as well as make crucial decisions for financial, economical. So the tool itself, individual crop models, and you see each one of those crops on the right-hand side. Under cereals, you have things like rice and wheat and maize. There are 29 other, like I said, approximately 28 different crop models incorporated into DSAT. I will be focusing on maize and soybean primarily, since my region of interest will be the Missouri River Basin. And each one of those models, each one of those crop models allows you to select from a variety of cultivars, so that you may be growing a particular type of maize or soybean in a particular area. And so you want to ensure that you are getting good, reasonable results for the type of crop that you're interested in. So that's one component of DSAT, is the crop simulation models themselves. Another component is the database management programs that allow you to specify things like soil conditions or soil type, as well as the weather conditions that are co-located with the crops at particular regions. And then you incorporate the decision support systems. And so there's a lot of communication between these three components right here of the DSAT tool. And that allows for this kind of agro-technology transfer concept to take form, so that the people who use this tool can make decisions that benefit them as well as the people around them. So ultimately, DSAT simulates growth and phenological development along with yield, which actually is a function of the interaction between the soil, the plant, and the atmosphere throughout time. So again, what you see on the right-hand side is actually the graphical user interface. When you open up the DSAT software on Windows, this is the main screen you see. And there, so I just wanted to give a picture of what that looks like. We won't actually be going through and running an experiment ourselves during this presentation, but at a later date, when I get further along in my research, I could probably do another webinar that actually shows how to run the crop model. I'll show results of other people running the crop model, but I won't actually incorporate any results or any actual experiments that I've done myself yet until a later date. So there may be some interest in that. So let's talk about what DSAT requires. DSAT requires this concept of a minimum data set that you need to evaluate the DSAT tool. So the first thing is site weather data for at least, at a minimum, the duration of the growing season. You also need to provide information about the type of soil that is co-located with the crop of interest, or crops of interest, because you can look at multiple crops in even a small area. Then you need to consider crop management, related to applying nitrogen fertilizer, particular amounts of nitrogen fertilizer at different times during the experiment, so that the model can simulate all the crucial components needed for evaluation. Then, of course, obviously this is kind of implied that if you're going to evaluate how well the model does, you need observed experimental data from a particular location. So that is the concept of the minimum data set. Let's talk about now the weather data that is needed. So we'll dig a little bit deeper into the minimum data set right now. So at the very least, you need daily inputs, or at daily time steps. You need daily maximum and minimum air temperature. You also need total rainfall in millimeters at a daily time step. You need daily values of solar radiation, and that's in megajoules per meter squared, which is a flux. Then you also need to be specific about the site where the weather data is coming from, in terms of latitude and longitude. You can potentially increase the results of your simulation if you include things such as dry and wet bulb temperature, as well as wind speed. Again, I mentioned you need this data for at least the duration of the growing season, the duration of the experiment, but ideally you will have weather data a few weeks available for a few weeks prior to planting, as well as post-harvest, to ensure that you are getting the simulation results that you can rely on to make crucial decisions with going forward. So I think hopefully it's clear, a little more clear by now, that DSAT is this tool that can really help plan for future cropping strategies in the face of climate variability and climate change, which seems to be an increasing concern as we observe what's happening from in the news and what you read about in journals almost constantly now. So it allows people who use this tool to ask hypothetical what if type scenarios or questions that have economic implications as well as food security implications. An example, I just provide one example of a question that someone can answer using DSAT. You can ask yourself, what happens to the maize crop that you plant if you're anticipating a drought to occur in the near future? What happens if you plant your maize crop 2 weeks earlier than you expect in an effort to mitigate against that predicted drought? That's one big thing that DSAT can be used for. Other applications, and there are many of them, range from things such as yield gap analysis, precision agriculture relating to on-farm management. Like I said, you can have kind of like multiple crops within a small, relatively smaller area, and you can account for the different crops in such a small region, and that allows you to deal with spatially that allows you to manage in a spatially variable environment quite well. You also can consider, again, what it's like with rain-fed and irrigation scenarios related to management, how different fertilizer can maybe help improve the yield of the crop at a given time under certain weather conditions. This kind of stuff. Going beyond that, you again have applications related to climate variability and risk management. This tool can give you an opportunity to do types of analysis related to seasonal strategy or crop rotation analysis even in the face of climate change and climate variability. Again, there's just many applications that can also help out with insurance decisions that farmers need to maybe take into account to help protect themselves in the case that maybe their crops are negatively impacted by things such as droughts or floods. So now let's talk a little bit about the limitations of DSAT. The software itself is not naturally intuitive unless you have a background probably in agronomy and crop science phenology. If you don't have that kind of a background, it makes it a little more difficult to understand exactly how the software works and the order in which the software has to work. So it's not naturally intuitive. Again, you have to put careful concern, or you have to deal with being carefully concerned with how you input stuff into, or crucial data into the DSAT tool in order to make sure you correctly simulate the experiments so that you can have confidence about your projections and your predictions of crop management going forward. It is available for you to run this through Linux, but because the DSAT Foundation does not have any direct funding for that, for running in Linux, they don't have any real support for that if you have trouble trying to compile the source code or running it. and running the model through Linux. You basically, you can get some questions answered, but there's no dedicated support officially for running through Linux. So you kind of probably have to figure out more on your own without having reliable support on a consistent basis. But it is there in case you like to work with Linux and you like a challenge. Now the workshop cost, in terms of time, if I did not attend the workshop, it would have taken me a lot longer to figure out this crop model. And so for that, it's actually a good thing that I was able to attend this workshop, because it did save a lot of time in trying to figure out how the model itself runs, or the tool, I should say, how the tool itself runs. But in terms of cost, it's quite expensive. $1,500 for registration alone. That did not include airfare or hotel. Again, I thank Dr. Walker and Emily for helping out with that. So those are just some of the limitations associated with DSAT itself. There's probably a couple more that I'm not thinking of right off the top of my head, but overall, it seems to be a pretty good tool, as we'll see here in the next slide, I believe. Okay. While we're kind of on the subject of limitations, we need to consider other important aspects regarding models. Not every model is pretty much wrong to some extent. Some are just more wrong than others. But they can be useful. If you have good input, you can probably have good output in most cases. But again, models are not perfect, and they require careful testing and evaluation prior to application. But this is probably the biggest consideration for someone who is actually using DSAT. If they're trying to advise a farmer or a policymaker on a course of action, they really should not say, you should do this. You should instead provide them with options that the DSAT tool can provide. You want to be able to enable informed final decisions, but you don't want to be telling the farmers or the policymakers that this is the decision that you need to take. You let them make the decision, because that's really ultimately their job, is to make the decision based on the tools they have available to them. Now, what you see here on the right-hand side is the soybean model that was eventually incorporated into DSAT when DSAT came into existence in the mid-1980s. But this is the soybean model that was used, and it was tested and calibrated based on this particular experiment. So what you see here in red and green, that is the above ground biomass of the soybean crop. And so one thing to keep in mind here is that you're not looking at curve fitting at all. We're not trying to apply a curve to these individual observations in any way. This is actually a dynamic simulation. Again, the red and green curves are simply simulating above ground biomass for soybean. The blue and gray curve themselves are the yield that is produced by the model or simulated by the model after you see a good amount of drought stress near the middle of July. So there's no difference. Actually, I should specify one thing here. The red curve is irrigated. The green curve is rain-fed. So when the rain falls off, this is what happens in your simulation. You can see the drought stress indicated by the gap between the red and the green curves then taking place. And that also shows up in the simulated yield as well, a little bit further down when we've actually reached crop maturity. So overall, the model does a fairly good job, but it's not perfect. Like in this instance or this instance, these are the observations from the actual field itself. And this is what the model had simulated. So there is some difference between the actual simulation and what happened in real life, but overall the DSAT, at this point it wasn't DSAT, but at this point the soybean model that was eventually incorporated into DSAT was doing a very good job of simulating above ground biomass as well as yield. So anyway, that's all you need to really consider for important considerations, I think, at this point. So now let's talk about briefly how I plan to incorporate DSAT into the Missouri transect research that I'm conducting here at the University of Missouri in Kansas City. So obviously in the face of climate change and climate variability, there are concerns for what the growing season will look like in the Missouri River Basin. So these are questions that we hope to answer with a tool like DSAT. We want to know how past climate variability has influenced particularly corn and soybean yields within the basin. And if the DSAT tool can replicate the yields for corn and soybean yields within agricultural districts inside the river basin fairly well for a past time step or a historical time frame, then we can then ask, well, how could future yields be affected by climate variability? And this is really what we are concerned with, is the food security implications. What will those be at a local and regional level within the river basin itself? And that includes that portion of Missouri that lies within the river basin specifically, but we will cover all of Missouri as well. So what you see on the left is my region of interest. The Missouri River Basin is the second largest basin in the United States. It covers quite a big area, 10 different states in the upper Midwest or the Northern Plains region. And you see all the different agricultural districts that lie within each of those states that I will be looking at simulating yields for using DSAT. The questions that we saw on the previous slide are kind of set up so that they can be answered in this workflow that you see on the right-hand side of the slide. The first step really is to dynamically downscale atmospheric or climate model output from general circulation models that can be then used to make climate projections using a regional climate called the WRF. So it's kind of two phases essentially. In a sense, we'll be simulating first past climate variability, and then if we can simulate the past climate variability quite well, we can then have some confidence going forward with our future climate projections that will be based on emission scenarios that were outlined by the IPCC group. Then we'll take that high resolution output or the higher resolution output from the WRF model, and we'll take that specifically with respect to the minimum weather data that you need to run DSAT, we'll use that as input then into the DSAT crop model to look at how maize and soybean yields have historically been a result of, as well as what future yields in terms of potential production going forward look like. So that's kind of what I'm interested in doing here in Kansas City. If anybody has any ideas, I would love to hear them, actually. I have contact information at the end of this presentation. So feel free to get a hold of me after the presentation. We can meet one-on-one. I could come out to Columbia sometime if somebody's interested in actually having an in-person discussion, or we can talk online, but we'll save that for later. Just a brief summary of the workshop itself. It was really good to have hands-on learning experience with exercises. So we didn't just get lecture the entire time. It was important to have that hands-on learning time with the crop model. So for that, it was a very good experience, and it was, I would say it was necessary to attend, honestly, because if you have any hope of trying to figure out how to work with the DSAT tool, you need this time, and it's worth the money in this case. It also served as a great networking opportunity because it allowed for the identification of future collaborations that could relate to the Missouri Transect project and beyond. I've got just a few references listed here. There are many, but I just chose the main ones or the primary ones that anybody might be interested in for right now. But I can provide a lot more references if anybody is curious in the future. I took audio files of the workshop. They allowed me to record audio of the workshop, but they did not allow me to record actual video. So I do have those. I have software exercises that if anybody's interested, they can get those from me. I can even show them how to install the software and work with the software if somebody's interested in working with the software more. It's free. It used to cost money, but now the software is free, so that's not a concern. You just have to register with them on their website, which I provide here. I also have their presentations, the original presentations from the workshop. With that, I will take questions or comments. Or suggestions.
Ollie, can you see Amy's question in the chat?
Yes. Could you talk about the data sets used in the project outlined for the Missouri Transect? Are you collecting data yourself, or are you using known data sets? Maybe I should type that. Should I type this back to her, or can she hear me okay?
She might not have audio, or not audio, but she might not have a microphone.
Okay.
Yeah, she can hear.
If you're talking about the climate data, yes, I will be collecting that myself, actually, before I use it as input into DSAT. And that will come from running the WRF model. In terms of known data sets, other known data sets, I can't think of any off the top of my head. Maybe once I get a little more familiar with the crop model and running it myself, or the DSAT tool and running it myself, I might, that answer might change a little bit, but for right now, everything in terms of data sets that the model needs, I don't know if that's something that needs to maybe be specified. I think it's just something, let's see. Let me think about the question for a little bit longer. And if I can, I'll just get back with Amy on it once I've had some time to think about it a little bit more.
Any other questions for Ollie?
I know it's hard for people to think right now. It's summertime and people want to probably not be where they are right now. But I thank you for attending.
I think since everyone has your email on this page, if they have more questions, they can ask you later.
Yes, that would be fine. I welcome questions anytime.
Yes. And it looks like Terry has a question in the chat. She's inviting you to the Computer Science Institute in Kansas City next summer.
Sure. Do you know what days that will be, or what dates that will be? Okay.
Okay. Well, thank you, Ollie, so much, and I'll be in touch if you'd like to do another webinar later on once you.
Sure.
That. And I will make this available online as soon as possible.
All right. Thanks, Emily.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.